First, I guess let me just introduce myself and Chris. I'm Francesco Barbera. My associate Chris Jones uh, is here with me, and we, uh, my firm, Barbera Corporate Law. We're a startup firm. We represent early stage companies, startup and early stage companies, and handle like corporate structuring, capital raising transactions, and M&A transactions, and the kind of general business needs of growing companies. And most of the companies that we represent are or are planning to or in the middle of raising capital. And a lot of the early stage fundings that we do are in convertible securities, convertible notes, and safes. And a big part of the process that we go through with founders is educating them about these instruments, the implications of using them versus using a priced round, the impact on their ownership and cap table later down the road after conversion and so forth. And so it's a significant question that founders that are raising capital regularly confront and need to evaluate if they're choosing this kind of model of fundraising, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So we thought we would just do this webinar to provide an overview of the various considerations, give people an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully it's helpful in in your process as founders, and Jenny in your case, in your work with founders and so forth. So that's that's our purpose here. Our agenda is just introductions and kind of broad overview of like our general approach to this whole question of how do you plan your early stage funding. I want to briefly touch on, okay, convertible notes and safes are what are called convertible securities, but there's this whole other approach to funding, which is doing a priced round, and it's really worth putting this question into the context of, well, does it make sense to do a priced round or a convertible round? So I want to create that context, then dive into the similarities and differences between notes and safes, and then close with a kind of general summary and give you guys an opportunity to ask questions. So that's the agenda. The purpose here is really to keep things at a pretty high level. The kind of mathematics and variations in convertible notes and even safes can get really complex, and I don't, it's not the purpose of this presentation to really go deeply into the nuances, so much as just highlight that they're there, and also highlight kind of their implications and effects on founder fundraising and the capitalization of companies and so forth. So moving on, that's the broad overview of our agenda. Hopefully we'll kind of be done with my talking part relatively quickly. And I guess, to keep it kind of more interesting and informal, I want to welcome questions at any point in the presentation. It's a small group here, so you guys are welcome to, I don't know if you can raise your hands or just kind of chime in and ask questions in a conversational way. In the middle of my presentation. You don't have to worry about interrupting me or anything like that. Just chime in, and I think it'll be more valuable for everyone if we just have a dialogue along the way. So about us, I've already shared this. We're a transactional firm focused on representing startup, emerging growth companies, and social enterprise. Our mission is to help mission-driven founders build successful companies, generating positive impact and scale. And we love working, working with entrepreneurs is wonderful. They're some of the most passionate and hardworking and creative folks out there, and it's a privilege working with them to help them kind of create something from nothing. It's a very cool process, and we love doing it. So key principles. So I kind of want to talk, sort of big picture about the process of, thinking about a capital raise and raising money. And Jenny, who's on this call, has just wrote a fantastic book on this whole process, which you guys should read, called, actually, I forget what it's called. Jenny, what's your book called again?
Raise capital on your own terms. Thank you.
Yeah, raise capital on your own terms. And it's just kind of all about creating a customized approach to capital raising that is consistent with your values and your vision for your company and so forth. And it's a wonderful book, and Jenny's a real visionary in the field. So read that book for sure. But I really share Jenny's orientation towards the capital raising process. It is, it really is to my mind, it should be a founder-led process. And by that, what I mean is, like, as founders, you should educate yourself about the options that are available, and that is where we can come in, and lawyers like Jenny can come in and really, just sort of paint a picture of, like, here's what's available. Here's the toolkit that's available to founders to help them fund their company. And here are the various parts and pieces of the toolkit and how you can kind of fit it together, and what other founders have done at this stage in your company and so forth. And at a certain point in that process, in my experience, founders will have a good sense of what they want for their company and what they're comfortable offering to their investors. And that is really the goal of, the planning stages planning stages of a capital raise is get founders educated on the options and get them comfortable, get them to a place where they're really happy with what they're offering to their investors. And that kind of leads to the point number 2, which is, this is not an adversarial relationship. This is a partnership. At least it should be. And so what you want is a funding plan that meets your goals as a founder, is good for your company and its future, and is also and also meets the needs of your investors, whatever they are. It's finding that spot that I think is really like the sweet spot of a successful capital raising transaction. So those are kind of key principles. Moving on. So priced round versus convertible security. And guys, please stop me if I don't know. Please stop me if I'm assuming too much or assuming too little, and if you need me to kind of take a step back or explain something in more depth. But the difference, one of the sort of forks in the road or key differences that or key sort of decision points that founders face in their early stage funding is whether to do what's called a priced round or a convertible security in their seed funding round. There are other options, but for purposes of this webinar, we're really focusing on these two routes. And then notes and safes are convertible, both very similar convertible securities. So they're on the sort of right side of the ledger. But I want to take a moment to talk about the left side, the priced round, which is basically saying that if you want to buy a share of stock in my company costs $1, and that $1 will buy you X percentage ownership of the company. It's basically fixing a valuation of the company and selling stock in your company at that valuation. And there are a lot of virtues to that. There's the virtues of it are, number one, everybody knows what they're getting immediately, right? So investors understand what they're purchasing. You understand what you're selling. You understand what percentage of your company you're selling, and in exchange for what. And that's the clarity piece of the occasion. And there's a lot to be said for that, because a convertible security converts into equity at a later time, and the precise terms of the conversion are determined at a later time. And as a result of that, exactly how much of your company you're selling is the determination of that is deferred, and it becomes clear only in the future when you have a conversion event.
Francesco, are there ever factors where you would lay those out ahead of time in a convertible security?
Where you would lay out
like equity would be based on revenue generation, or equity would be based on contributions of XYZ, like in advance?
Typically, let me make sure I understand your question. Like, in a convertible security, do you lay out in advance what the terms are of the conversion? Or
like could you say that, meeting these factors will drive up your percentage, and not meeting these factors will, keep the percentage capped?
You can do things like that in a convertible security. In other words, so as a baseline, safes and notes will specify the terms under which the notes and safes convert into stock. So most of them, I would say virtually all of them, convert when you raise the next round of funding, or in connection with the sale of the company, or other liquidation type scenario. And the terms of the conversion typically are tied to the terms of the conversion event, whether it's an equity financing or another event. Now, the kind of customization that you are talking about is possible to place into an instrument, and that, but the trade-offs of that are a few. The trade-offs of that are that, number one, it increases the costs of the funding round in a number of respects. First, it's like you're introducing kind of unfamiliar terms, and that means additional terms to negotiate with investors, and get on the same page with investors. Most investors are fairly familiar with the general mechanics of convertible securities. So if you introduce a lot of customization, it could increase the transaction costs associated with your funding rounds. So one of the main virtues, and I touch on this in number 3, is kind of speed and cost. Because the convertible notes, at least, have been used, kind of for a while in early stage funding rounds, a lot of the investor base is relatively familiar with at least the basic mechanics of it and how it works. Increasingly, that's the case with safes, but much less so, and definitely much less so outside, I would say, of like, the Silicon Valley type investor community. But because of that kind of familiarity, and because there's relatively few points that are being negotiated, a convertible, a financing done with a convertible security, there's relatively minimal documentation, and negotiations are relatively uncommon, really. You might have like a side letter addressing this or that, but in general, negotiating with individual investors is not a thing, and that's a strong virtue. So I don't know if that answered your question, Jordan. That's just a kind of broad overview.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, good. Okay, so price. So the clarity of like knowing what you're selling and investors knowing what they're buying is, I think, a significant virtue. The downsides or the trade-offs of that are associated with, number one, a priced round generally has kind of generally requires a little more legal documentation up front to spell out the rights and preferences of the stock that you're selling. And so there typically is like, rather than a single legal document, multiple legal documents that are associated with a priced round. And that increases, I think, some of the upfront legal costs. And the other thing is that it, when someone buys stock, they become a stockholder, and there are rights that are attached to stockholders. Stockholders have voting rights and information rights, and there may be negotiations related to board control and so forth. None of that is necessary. None of that's required. I should say that obviously stockholders have specific rights under the statutes. You don't have to provide a board seat and things like that. But the voting and control issues are a factor when you're selling stock, whereas when you're doing a convertible security, your investors don't become stockholders until their instrument converts into stock. And typically that occurs, after a year or two, when the company's more mature and has legs under it, and is really a bit more prepared for a more substantial corporate governance function. So I guess in summarizing this priced round versus convertible security, I think it is what I have seen and found is that the kind of speed and agility that the convertible securities enables in terms of a seed round funding where you're approaching a lot of individuals and closing investments in relatively small increments, it's a very powerful and useful tool for founders who are maybe like particularly founders who are raising for the first time, and they're really approaching a lot of investors, not really in a position to raise like a large sum of money from a single investor, like $1 million from one investor, or even 500,000 from one investor. Like they're really more in a position to be closing like $25,000 and $50,000 and $75,000 investments from individuals. In those contexts, convertible securities can really provide a lot of advantages in terms of low costs and agility and speed to close and so forth. And where founders have the wherewithal and positioning to close a more significant investment, whether it's from a family office or a very wealthy angel or an institutional investor, a priced round in that context tends to be more on the table and certainly something that should be more on the table. So that's kind of a summary kind of headline of my overall experience with this determination. But I think a priced round should be part of the conversation for all founders, and part of that process of getting educated, understanding the options, and getting really comfortable and happy with the offering that you're putting together and going out to investors with. So, all right, moving now to comparing convertible notes and safes. So this, we're assuming now that you're not doing a priced round, that you're moving and you're going to do a convertible security. And at this point, the decision tree for most founders is, okay, do I do a convertible note or do I do a safe? There are some other instruments out there, but at this point, I think these two instruments, at least in my experience, are sort of dominate the seed funding landscape at this point. They're very much, and I think in explaining or diving into the similarities and differences, it's kind of useful to provide a little context about the safe. So, so convertible notes developed as a solution, became an early stage funding tool and solution to really address one of the main problem or challenges with early stage companies, which is that they're very difficult to value, and having a negotiation around valuation at a point in the company where there is so little to go on, it produced kind of expenses that didn't necessarily make sense. So what convertible notes enabled is the deferral of that whole question of valuation to a later and more mature stage of the company. And the way that they worked is that an investor lends the company some money, company agrees to pay interest, and there's a maturity date, usually between 1 and 3 years. And then when and if there's a funding round before maturity, the note converts in that funding round, usually at a discounted price. So if your later investors, your Series A investors, pay $1 a share, the note converts at 80 cents a share. So your note investors get more shares of the Series A preferred stock for their $1, and that's as a reward for their earlier stage investment and their and the additional risk associated with that earlier stage investment. So what that did was it enabled like reduced negotiation costs and transaction costs and deferred the valuation question. In a few years ago, Y Combinator, a technology accelerator, introduced the SAFE, which was designed to preserve some of the favorable features of notes while eliminating some of the debt-like features. So a SAFE has that same conversion feature in a financing, but it doesn't have the debt-like features of the accrual of interest and a maturity date. And the accrual of interest and a maturity date are really like the sort of the core differences, but there are a number of others that we'll get into. Now, the absence or the deletion or the elimination of a maturity date had a lot of implications. That was a very kind of company favorable shift, because what would happen with convertible notes if there wasn't a conversion event and the maturity date arrived, there would be some kind of coming together of the parties, and typically there would be a renegotiation. There's where the founders are negotiating with their investors to extend the maturity date, and that negotiation may involve a recalibration of the relationship between founders and investors. So it was really like a kind of a point of accountability and a touch point. The Y Combinator safe eliminated that and created this possibility of this safe instrument just kind of sitting out there for a really long period of time, with investors not really having, if there was no conversion event, investors would have a contract, but no rights associated with the contract and no accrual of interest and so forth. So it was a very founder favorable document. Now, more recently still, in 2018, Y Combinator updated the safe and issued to what's now called a post-money safe, or the post-money valuation safe. And that's the instrument that I'm going to focus on because it's the most current iteration of the safe, and it is a more balanced document, to be sure. In other words, whereas the original safe, I think, was extremely company or founder friendly, the newer safe is a more balanced instrument and is in a lot of respects, in particular as to the conversion terms, can be very investor favorable. And so we need, it's important for founders to kind of keep an eye on that. So all that being said, similarities between notes and safes are many. The key similarity is they just, they defer the valuation question. They're generally signed with investors. There's a single legal contract that investors need to sign. They convert automatically in connection with an equity financing. You use valuation caps and discounts in order to appropriately reward your seed stage or earlier stage investors. And they both generally provide for some kind of a payout if there's a sale of the company before an equity financing event. Where the two instruments differ, I've talked about investor familiarity and comfort. So notes, I think, have been around longer, and they're much more widely in use across a wider swaths of the investor community. Safes, I think, safes were developed by Y Combinator, which is a technology incubator that, is one of the most elite incubators in the world. So it's an instrument that is really designed for investors in high growth companies. And so I think it's in less widespread use, and investors may be, depending on who you're approaching, there may be less familiarity and comfort with that instrument, as opposed to an instrument where they're, for example, earning interest on their money. There's a maturity date. They have the rights associated with being a creditor of the company. That's something that I think a lot of, there's a familiarity with the simple idea of kind of debt converting into stock, compared to this contract with a clever name, that I think, that that I think is worth taking into account, and founders should take it into account based on who they're going to talk to and who their investor community is, and the kinds of people that they will be trying to attract as investors. Safes, of course, do not accrue interest, and they do not, at least the default version of it, does not have a maturity date. So this means that, yeah, as you said, with a convertible note, while the note is not converted, the principal accrues interest, and that interest either converts or is paid out when there is a conversion event like a financing. Then there typically is a maturity date. Not typically, in a convertible note, there is always a maturity date, and that is, generally 12 months to 3 years out in my experience. And what happens at the maturity date is either the note comes due and payable, or there's a number of things that that founders can provide for on a maturity date, like you can provide for an automatic conversion of the note upon maturity, or an automatic extension of the note on maturity at a higher interest rate. So there is, you could also specify, when you do specify that the note will convert at maturity, you can specify on what terms it converts, and so forth. But always there is this kind of maturity date, which is a kind of point of accountability, and it kind of provides a definite sort of expiration date, so to speak, for the convertible note. Now, a safe.
Sorry, could one of those options also be a buyout to buy back the equity from the borrowing, or is that pretty untypical?
You mean to
like let's say in a best case scenario, my company is going gangbusters, I pay off the loan completely, and then I'm done with the investor, or is that unusual?
It's quite unusual. I mean, a typical note, let's say, it's often in most convertible notes, I would say, what happens at maturity is the note simply comes due and payable. And so if you have the money to pay it back, and there has been no conversion event, then typically you would pay it back. But in my experience, that's relatively uncommon, because in growth companies, most of the time they either they don't have the capital yet, or they don't want to spend it in that way. They want to reinvest the money in the business, So, but that being said, it is possible to simply repay the note. The broader question of whether you can negotiate a kind of option to repurchase your investors' equity is, as a broader answer to that, generally not really, because the only time that it will, most of the time, like if there's a really positive upside scenario where it will make sense for the company to buy back the investor's investment, kind of investors in that scenario don't want to be bought out. They want to be rewarded for their investment, So they don't generally, in my experience, want to give founders that option. On the other hand, they do want what they do tend to want is the ability to force companies to buy them, to buy them out at a fixed price at their option, is a request that I see pretty often.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So this maturity date issue is I think a pretty significant difference. Safes can be, and I've seen safes that are modified to have an expiration date at which point they convert as well. So if you customize a safe, you can, kind of make it even more similar to a convertible note by adding an expiration date, which I think can make a lot of sense. For example, if you add an expiration date to your safe that says, look, if there hasn't been an equity financing in 2 years, then the safe will convert into common stock at the valuation cap. That provides kind of certainty all around as to the fate of the as to what's going to happen with the safe. Investors know up front, okay, that's, that at the very least they'll get common stock at that valuation if there's no financing, and then they'll get the rights of a stockholder at that time. Otherwise the safe just sits out there as a contract without the rights of stockholders. So conversion mechanics. There are with the new post money safe. If you're going with that kind of default formulation, that is a very kind of investor. Now, the virtues of the post money safe are that you kind of know, it's easy to know what percentage ownership of the company you're giving to your investors, assuming that you raise the amount that you're planning to raise. The disadvantages are that all of the safes that you raise, the founders bear the full burden of all of the dilution of all rounds of safe that you raise. And that is not necessarily the case with convertible notes. So you can have, so I guess rather than going into real details on these kind of conversion mechanics, I think the key thing that I want to share here with founders is, it is really important to kind of have a general fundraising plan, and I recognize that there's a lot of unknowns at the early stages, but it's really important to have at least your reasonable best shot at an anticipated funding plan, and then to model it out mathematically using the options that are on the table. So if you're using a post-money safe, you need to understand what that means from a math perspective. It is not at all obvious, and it's surprisingly complex how to figure out exactly how much stock your safe investors are going to get, and exactly how much stock your note investors are going to get. And cap table math is just, it's just not something that first-time founders in particular have a lot of experience with. So you have to really kind of slow down and really kind of educate yourself on the math. And we have models that kind of map out and enable you to kind of like input your variables and different possible scenarios, and it'll spit out like what the different the different outcomes are to your dilution in those different scenarios. So the headline here is, take the time to really dig into the math and model out what the future holds based upon your anticipated funding plan, and what happens if you maybe need to raise an additional round of funding before your Series A, and so forth. So take the time to understand that. Okay, a couple of other key differences between notes and safes that are relevant. Convertible notes, because they are because they're debt, the investors have a priority position over all stockholders in a dissolution. Now, safes, the new safes are junior to debt. They have a provision in there that basically says that they're pari passu with preferred stock in a dissolution. So debt is ahead of them on in priority in a dissolution scenario, but common stock is below the safe. So the convertible notes are a little bit more investor favorable in that context. The new safes entitlement to dividend, the new safes also provide that that if there's, you know, we talked about the absence of a maturity date, the new safes do say that, you know, if the safe is sitting there outstanding and there's been no conversion event, and there happens to be payout of dividends or profits, that the safe holders participate pro rata in dividends. And so that solves, or at least addresses, I think, one of the major investor shortcomings of safes from an investor standpoint, which is that, well, what happens, you know, if there is no conversion event and I just have this contract with no rights? Well, at least this provision says they'll participate pro rata in dividends. They don't have any other shareholder rights, but they at least get that. And I think it's just sort of a strange predicament for investors. And I think it's a byproduct of the origin of safes in an accelerator Y Combinator that is totally designed to invest in high growth companies. Like, they don't, in the Y Combinator model, and invest in a company that they invest in is either successful and immediately raises more money, or it flames out and fails. There's really not much middle ground, and that's why Y Combinator doesn't really care about a model where founders organically grow the company and maybe don't require additional funding. And so, you know, and it's you know, what that means is, like, you know, you really like, you need to, getting back to like investors or partners, if that's a possibility or a way that you want to grow your company, if that's on the table for you, then that's really something to think about in terms of offering investors safes. Like, do you really want your investors to just have this contract with no rights of the shareholders and so forth? I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's just something to really be aware of and think about. And then finally, this potential tax treatment. The tax treatment of safes is totally unsettled. So I just need to preface the conversation with that statement. The tax treatment of notes and safes are similar in that there's no kind of open and shut answer to how the security will be categorized, whether it'll be characterized as debt or equity. Now, convertible notes obviously have more features, more debt-like features, and will tend to get categorized as debt. However, if they're issued in a context where their conversion to stock is, you know, kind of really close to guaranteed, that tax treatment of notes may be different, you know, and may be treated as equity. Now, yeah, Jenny?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, because no one ever talks about this when they're talking about safes, and I think it's a huge risk. I think it's true, it can be a risk with a convertible note as well, but with a safe, from what I understand, the CPAs that are willing to deal with safes are characterizing them as equity. My CPA will not deal with safes, by the way, but no one at Y Combinator seems to ever mention this. that there is this potential risk that it could be seen as neither equity nor debt and just regular income. So I'm just wondering, how do you deal with this? Do you just tell your clients it's a risk? Why do you think more people aren't talking about this risk? Because there could be huge fallout if the IRS started to really look at this.
I think that Y Combinator has, in the new SAFE, tried to fix some of the uncertainty around it by making the instrument even more equity-like. So, for example, this entitlement to dividends that I was talking about, and it, is one example. The position of safes in dissolution is another example. And they explicitly added a provision in the new SAFE saying it's intended to be treated as common stock. So I think that there is an awareness of I think there's an awareness that that it is a factor and the uncertainty is a factor. I think that the nature of the uncertainty, I hadn't seen, Jenny, like anybody saying there was a risk that money received would be treated as ordinary income. I'd never heard that, and I'd be curious to hear more about that. What have you heard about that?
Yeah, because if you just look at the IRS definitions of equity or debt, SAFE doesn't really fall within either one. So I have heard from some people with accounting backgrounds that is a risk. I have no idea how likely it is to happen, but it would be a horrible problem if all of a sudden you had to, treat your investments like income.
Yeah. Well, that would be a disastrous outcome. I think that, but from my understanding and from what I have seen, the real debate centered on whether the SAFE was either properly categorized as equity or as what's called like a prepaid variable forward contract. Like that the amount that you receive in the SAFE is kind of a deposit against the purchase price of the stock to be purchased at a later time. And I think that the earlier SAFE, there was not at all very much confidence in the equity categorization. And I think that with the new SAFE, there's more of a comfort level with the equity categorization. And my expectation or an understanding is that investors are just kind of assuming, everyone is basically assuming that this equity categorization is basically just going to work out. And it's part of the, it's just part of the kicking the can down the road philosophy of using convertible securities is like, let's keep it simple, let's get it done, minimize transaction fees and so forth. So
got it. Okay, thank you so much. Super helpful.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, what do you, Jenny, do you use safes or you see your clients using them?
Occasionally. I tend to advise against them, one, because of the tax uncertainty, and two, because sometimes I feel like it sends the wrong message to the type of investors that my clients are reaching out to, because I work with clients that are trying to connect with investors who are much more values aligned, probably a lot less sophisticated. And sometimes the term safe, either they don't know what it is or they've heard about it and it's not, and it kind of sounds sharky to them. Like, oh, it's a great tool for a really sophisticated investor. And when there's a lot of confidence that there's going to be the priced round coming up soon. But, if you're on a different path, I just think it's quite, I think it's too investor unfriendly for a lot of my clients. They don't feel like it sends the right message to their potential investors.
Yeah, I think that's a really legitimate position to take around safes. You know, it is, you know, going back to why safes, the context in which they were created, is that they would either become valueless very quickly or they would convert into equity very quickly, you know. And in a lot of startup contexts, and Y Combinator, these are the most competitive, highly sought after startups in the entire world, you know, like thousands of startups compete for a position and very few get entered. So this is like the very elite cream of the crop startups that they're just going to get funded, you know? And so, you know what, most startups do not fall in that category. And like, so for founders, you know, so really, you know, it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense for investors to be in this kind of contractual relationship when it's really more akin to like a partnership relationship, you know. So that's definitely, I think, you know, I share those concerns and appreciate you bringing them forward here for sure.
Although I will say sometimes we do use them, and we often modify them so that there's a potential conversion even if there isn't a priced round or a sale.
Yeah, like a kind of like a maturity date kind of concept.
Yeah, or based on reaching a certain milestone.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
I have to jump off, but this was really awesome. I hope we can, I want to hear more about all your thoughts on this at some point.
That's good, Jenny. Wonderful to be with you. Have a good one.
Yeah, good to meet everyone. Bye.
I have to do the same, Francesco. I'm really sorry. I have a 12 o'clock too.
Absolutely. Our hour's up anyway. So, so thanks for joining, Jordan. And you have any other questions, feel free to email myself or Chris.
Thank you. I know Chris from the Alt MBA, which we both did together. And so I've been following along with what you guys are doing, and I really appreciate it. This is super helpful.
Good. Glad to hear it. Thanks so much, Jordan.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Yeah.